data. That is what is shown here, if you recall. So we had this stress strain curve. I'm sorry that we are still talking about materials data, but we'll try to simplify and correlate it to what you can understand and maybe appreciate a little. So this was the tensile test where we were pulling a sample, and the stress strain data, if it's an ideal nice curve, then it should have a linear elastic portion, and then there is a plastic portion. So we were talking only about these two quantities. One was the elastic modulus, which was the slope of the initial part of the curve. One can calculate them so you test not just one sample, right? You will test multiple samples and you will get the elastic modulus measurement from all those samples, and then you can get a mean and a standard deviation with respect to that. Similarly, you will get yield strengths, and you can also get the mean and the variance in that particular data. And it is important because you want to know what is the maximum load that I can apply on a specimen before it fails. There are certain things that we did talk about, but certain things that we did not talk about yesterday. For example, if you have you looked at that UTM, right? The universal testing machine that Professor Preeta Pant was showing. So this is the overall machine where you have these what are called as crossheads, which are the the grip section plus the machine itself which moves, and the specimen itself is a small part which is in series with the crosshead. Okay, so the specimen is deforming by the load that are applied, or the displacement that is applied slightly away from it. So there is a sum total of the specimen displacement as well as the machine displacement that is always occurring in the specimen. So if you measure what is called as the crosshead displacement, which is the displacement between these 2 points, then you will have the displacement of the specimen plus the machine displacement added together. So the actual curve that you will get in that case is a load displacement curve, which looks like this black curve. So you can see that the slope of this curve, what is called as a linear elastic part, is pretty low. So if you convert this to a stress strain curve, you will get a modulus, elastic modulus, which is very low compared to what is expected for that material, because the displacement that it's measuring is not of the specimen alone, but of the specimen and the machine. So this is called a machine compliance error. So what is also done is nowadays people have extensometers. These are devices which will measure the displacement of the specimen directly. So one is a contact or a physical extensometer, which you can attach to the specimen. It's like a clip, and so it can it'll move along with as the specimen deforms, whether it's getting elongated or whether it's getting compressed. It will move along with it, and there is a sensor which will detect how much voltage change occurs while it moves, and therefore it's able to record the displacement. So this will record purely the displacement of the specimen. Then there are non-contact extensometers, because when you have very small samples, you cannot put a clip gauge or something around it because the weight of the gauge itself will lead to errors. Therefore, there are laser extensometers, there are other electromagnetic extensometers, which will again measure the displacement in the specimen by shining a piece of light, and you can have markers on the specimen, and you can then measure the extent of deformation. And the data, when you do it like that on the same specimen, will look like this. The load displacement curve, you can see that the initial linear elastic part has now a much higher slope. Right, so this is the actual deformation of the specimen, and when you calculate the elastic modulus from this kind of a curve, you will get the more accurate elastic modulus. Why I talked about the extensometer is that we use the extensometer not just to get the overall displacement of the sample. We can also use what is called as digital image correlation. So what is done is you have a sample, you spray paint on the sample in a certain way such that you get contrast on all the, all these points on the sample. And then again, you shine light and you allow it to deform, much like what the specimen that Professor Preeta Pant was showing, where they had a coating and the coating sort of broke open, and therefore you could measure strain, right? So these image correlation softwares are available. It's basically an image correlation tool which will allow for measurement of individual points of strain. So if what do I expect in a tensile sample? Because it's being uniformly pulled, I would expect that the strain is the same everywhere, right? So there was actually no need to use an extensometer. But after this point, or let me use this curve, after this point, which is called as a necking point, there are certain things that happen which make the strain very non-uniform in the specimen. Okay, so it starts to neck down, the cross-section becomes non-uniform. So all of these things can be detected using the digital image correlation software. So one such image is shown here for your reference. So the image is basically a contour map. Okay, so the contour map looks like this. You have a color coded map that will come out of the machine, let's say. What does this color coding mean? Let's say this was, please ignore all the other curves here, just follow the red curve. This is the stress strain curve that was recorded for this particular specimen. And the strain map on the sample is shown for this particular point alone. So the overall global strain here is about 0.16 or 16%. Okay, but you can see that there is a distribution of strains that are seen in this contour map. So if it was uniform strain, all these points should have experienced that amount of 16% strain. But clearly at this point, you see that there is a distribution in the strain. And what is that distribution? Of course, closer to the gauge section of the specimen, closer to the grip section of the specimen, where the cross section becomes, more non-uniform. The stress, which is load per unit area, will decrease because the load is the same, but the area is increasing. So at the ends, you will always expect a much lower stress, which is okay. So we'll ignore that. But if you look at the quantities which are from green to red also, which is well within the central part or the gauge of the specimen, you will still see a distribution. And this distribution tells us that there is something non-uniform occurring, which is probably due to the material, because your applied strain state was uniaxial and uniform. So what exactly is happening, and where are those points of localization of strain? How much is the difference in strain at the highest point and the lowest point? All of these can be obtained through contour maps. So you can see that the highest strain in this sample occurs somewhere in this region, let's say at 20%. Although the applied global strain is only 16%, at some point in the region of the sample, the strain has actually reached higher value of 20%. Whereas more or less in the rest of the region, you will see that it is having a strain of around 16 to 17%. But how to visualize this data better? This data can be visualized better by plotting again a histogram. So you can always plot a histogram even of a sort of three-dimensional data. What is three-dimensional about this is that the position is stored as pixels, which are the pixel X and pixel Y. So the position is the position X and Y, which will locate one of the pixels, and each pixel will be, assigned a particular strain that has been measured. So that way it is having two columns to mark the position XY and one extra column to mark the strain at that particular position. This is a 2D strain map, therefore there is no Z direction in the position. If there was a 3D correlation, then even the Z direction get added up. So you can, of course, plot a three-dimensional map as well. But more importantly, let's say I want to just look at the distribution of strains and take a good look at whether the distribution is uniform. What is it spread, normally across the mean, or does it have some other distribution? Why does it have some other distribution? And these may be some of my questions. So what is plotted here is the number fraction as a function of the effective strain. So forget what is effective strain, it's just telling you the strain at each position. And since the strain is varying, so the range from 0.06 to 0.2 has been equally broken, right? And so sort of binned. And that histogram is basically plotted. The histogram of strain is plotted, and that histogram is converted to a number fraction, which is that let's say at a particular strain of 10%, you had so many, pixels showing that amount of strain, that is divided by the total number of points that were measured. So that will give you the number fraction. So the fraction of those points which are experiencing 10% strain. This tells you the fraction of points that are experiencing about 15% strain. This tells something about 18 or 17% strain and so on. So you can still see that the peak, so where this particular point peaks, of course, this will not look like a normal distribution. This has a skewed distribution, let's say, with the longer tail in the left. But you can see that the maximum still is at the global strain of about 16%, which is what is the applied strain. So that way, this data is fine. But one has to see why you have a larger percentage of lower, strain regions. This could be, one of the reasons could be that we are calculating, or we are, taking the strains from regions which are very close to the grip, which is what is skewing the results. So it's possible that if you correct for that, it will show a more normal distribution. More than that, what can we do? We will just see in the following few slides. So I will go through a case study of what material we are looking at and then come back to the results. So we are looking at what are called as dual phase steels. Dual phase steels, for layman purposes, I'll tell you that steels are iron carbon alloys, primarily iron. And there are two phases in the particular material. One phase has a slightly higher carbon percentage and one phase has a lower carbon percentage. And the phase which has a higher carbon percentage also has a higher hardness, which means it's difficult to deform it. Whereas the one which has lower carbon is having a lower hardness. That means it's easy to deform it plastically. So, correlating it to what we learned yesterday, the one with the higher hardness called martensite, or phase B, has a higher yield strength or elastic limit. And the one with the lower carbon, which is the ferrite, has a lower yield strength. So this is the microstructure of the material that we are looking at. I showed you a microstructure of polycrystalline copper yesterday, which is having a lots of grain boundaries. Now, grain boundaries are not gaps, okay? So they are just differently oriented crystals, which are the misorientations are accommodated by. And you can see some of these black regions here, and those black regions are the second phases. I will not explain why there is a contrast here, but these black regions are all the second phase with a higher carbon and therefore a higher yield strength. And the lighter regions are all the lower fraction and lower carbon and lower yield strength phase. So that is why it's called a dual phase steel. And it's used in automobiles, especially in the car chassis. It's used because it's got a good amount of, it can take a good amount of deformation, as well as it has, so why is the deformation needed? Because you want to form these parts, right? First of all. So you want to form sheet metals and then form them into various shapes, and then fit it into a car. And in the process of driving, it should also satisfy what is called as a crash test. So therefore it should have enough toughness. So it sort of satisfies all these criteria, and therefore this particular material is used. And this is the sort of microstructure that we are looking at. Now, again, when we do certain kinds of heat treatments to these materials, there is, one type of heat treatment is called tempering. For common language, I will just say that this has been a sample that has been aged or annealed, which means it's just heated to a different temperature. So this is heated to a certain temperature, this is heated to a certain higher temperature or a longer time. Okay. So in the process, what happens, the martensite, the second phase, which had high carbon, sort of loses carbon and becomes softer. So basically the difference in hardness between the the two phases is highest here, and the difference in hardness goes down. And one can measure that using what are called as nano indentation experiments, which is a case study that will be shown to you in the next week's classes or lectures. So what this tells you is that as a function of the heating temperature and time, you see a drop in the hardness of the second phase, that is the red colored phase here, whereas the first phase remains more or less what it was. So that is some kind of treatment which changes one particular phase without changing the second phase by much. And just to be clear, these are standard deviations and not standard errors that are plotted. And the difference is coming because of the heterogeneity in the microstructure. So there are large standard deviations because The microstructure in the sense of, there are some very large grains and then there are very small grains and so on. So the hardness measurement is also dependent on that. And therefore you see these kinds of deviations. So again, I think you have now learned how to, given a set of data, how to plot the mean and the standard deviation and standard error. So we will move on from that. And we will see what was it used for, that the initial part of digital image correlation that I was talking about. So when these two types of samples were tested, one which was the as received dual phase steel, and the second one was this tempered, which was the heat treated steel, there was a difference in the stress strain curves that they showed. Of course, you can see that the initial elastic portion is now hidden because the total strain is very high. The initial elastic strain is actually a very small value, less than 0.2%. So it becomes, part of the vertical axis. And then you see this yielding occurring at different points. In this case, the yield strength also more or less remains the same, but what is called as the highest strength that the material can reach has decreased for the heat treated case. So the highest strength was at about 620 MPa or so, whereas for the heat treated case, the highest strength is only about 550 MPa or so. But if you look at the distribution of the strains in the two cases, you see that for the initial as received case, there was a localization point at this point of highest strength. There was this localization of strain, which tells us that the strain is very non-uniform. Whereas for this case, which is the heat treated case, it looks like the uniformity in strain is more. That means that the highest strain regions are distributed throughout the gauge length of the specimen. Right, so there is some distinct difference that you already see from the contour plots, and you can extract that data to find out whether that is really the case or not. Now, if you plot the effective strain at each location divided by the corresponding strain at necking. Now, don't worry what this is. This is the global strain that was applied for each of those cases. Then both those plots more or less match with each other in terms of the number fractions. Both of them have a slightly longer tail to the left, slightly skewed. But you see that they both have a peak where the applied strain matches with the the maximum fraction of the sample sees the same strain as the global applied strain. This is what this tells you. So more or less, both these samples are undergoing uniform deformation up to that point. One can see what happens before that point. For example, what is the strain distribution at this point versus what is at this point and so on. So these are the uses of plotting a histogram for these particular sets of data. And if you plot a point at a much higher strain, again, if I take the strain to above this point at let's say 20%, when it has already reached the highest strength and is now collapsing, this is a region where it has already entered some non-uniform strain in the sample. I was telling about necking. The sample sort of deforms too much and necks down. So in that region, if you look at the tempered cases, they show a more non-uniform distribution. There is a region of high strain. There is also a region which is sort of peaking at low strains. Whereas the as received sample is not doing so bad. The tempered cases are having a wider distribution. So one can apply certain conditions to see something more. For example, if I want to see how many points are in the sample which are experiencing more than 80% of the total strain range, that is what was applied here. And that's called as the density of localization. So localization, by which I mean all those points which are having a strain above a certain limit, let's say. I define it like that. Then I can define that and plot those as a function of global strains. So these are things that I think you will not be doing right now, but we can provide the data so that you can sort of practice, how to extract, how to use an equation to extract the data that is required from the raw data that is given, and then make these kinds of plots. Yeah, moving on. The next thing I wanted to talk about is dealing with what are already known as non-normal distributions. Most of the data we tend to see in the real world are normal, and that's the reason it's called normal, because it's so common. But there are certain material behaviors or what you get in measurements which are not normal, and they're already known as to why, and so the physics is also known. So we are going to give you a flavor of what is called as a Weibull distribution using a case study of fracture strength of glass. So glass is a very brittle material, like you already know. Have you seen any glass which is resistant to sort of, you know, high loads? Anyone? What are the kind of, I mean, what is the use of glass? Where do we use glass?
It has the feature, it has the attribute for transparency.
Mm-hmm.
And
Yes.
so whenever we want, we have to have this attribute in any of the product. We would like to have it.
Right. So there are so many, right? So many multiple applications of glass. I mean, windows and doors are the not doors as such, but you know, these mm, glass buildings that you see, for example. So glass is a very common use, especially in transparent applications. It's also used for, I mean, in case of, you know, bulletproof. So you need to toughen the glass, right? So what is a bulletproof glass? It's something that is modified at the surface such that a bullet cannot penetrate in one shot. Usually, you would expect that the glass would just shatter, whereas a toughened glass will not shatter very easily. There are various ways materials engineers can do this. If you have seen, there is a bridge in China that is advertised as a fully glass bridge. And you can go and, you know, try to hammer it. And you don't, I mean, you're basically standing on the bridge and you're trying out, trying to hammer it. And you see that thankfully nothing really collapses. So there are engineers who work on glass to make it tougher and so on. But our intention of showing this example is just to show what is called as a Weibull distribution. So as long ago as you know, Leonardo da Vinci's time, there was a measurement of the load carrying capability of any material. So Da Vinci, in fact, was a creative artist, scientist, all rolled into one, right? So he tested for, if I remember right, I think talked about iron wires. But anyway, so wired samples, he would hang a weight and you know, hold it along the wire that he wanted to test, and he would sort of load. I mean, he would probably place like a bucket, and he would keep loading that bucket until the wire snapped, and that is how he measured the weight that the wire would carry. And using these kinds of experiments, he observed, or he at least wrote in his observations, that he saw that the load carrying capability of the wire scaled with its length in a way such that longer the wire, lower was its load carrying capability. So this seems strange, right? Why should a longer wire you know, have a lower strength, or a lower load carrying capability? What has it got to do with the length of the wire? Do you want to take any guesses? I mean, should it matter? Should the length of the wire matter? See, what we have learned about strength is it is load per unit area, right? So length doesn't feature anywhere in the picture. So why should it matter on length? So there are some people who say that there was a mistake in what he wrote. He might have meant cross section. It could also be possible that as the length of the wire went up, some, you know, the cross section area sort of remained the same, and therefore there was some problems with that measurement. But all said and done, it sort of you know, brought about this concept of size effects, as though like size, again, like I was talking about yesterday also, smaller the stronger and so on. Similarly, this brought about a concept of size dependence of strength. From there, people have now come to what is called as a weakest link theory for brittle systems. So the probability of failure of a brittle system lies in its weakest link. So any system is actually full of defects. No system, no material that you can make is a perfect system. So defects can be in the form of small pores or voids or impurities or second particles. It could be anything. And this weak link is going to sort of pull down the entire structure. That is what this sort of theory says. So we want to find out if the distribution of these defects that are anyways pre-existent, is that a sort of more uniform distribution or a non-uniform distribution? How does it matter? Because anyways these contain defects, but we need to know whether the distribution of defects is uniform, such that if I take blocks of glass from various locations, let's say I have a large pane of glass, and I cut it into or cleave it and take smaller parts of it, then I should know that reliably the distribution of defects is going to be the same everywhere, so that whatever strength I have measured from one set of experiments, I can use that same strength and calculate the factor of safety. But if the distribution is non-uniform, then what happens? I would have tested from one corner where the defects, let's say, are very low in number, but in the other corner you have a very high number of defects, and that will actually break at a much lower strength. So you go and apply this part in a real application, your structure will collapse. So the engineer will be held responsible, of course. So one needs to know whether the defects are uniform or non-uniform. You cannot eliminate the defects, but you need to know for sure what kind of defect distribution it has. So that is what is being measured here. Usually for these are statistical tests, in the sense that larger sample sizes are required. Yesterday I was showing you some measurements which had sometimes, I mean, we can do with, for experimentalists, where things don't matter so much, they would say 3 measurements per condition is enough. But in most cases they will say 5 is enough. But in case of the Weibull analysis, you need at least 10 observations or 10 sample tests to be done and 10 data points to be collected. But 10 is also not enough. In fact, you should have larger the better. Okay? So the larger sample size is preferred here. So you should do as many tests as possible. So what we did was to get a bunch of our undergrads and split them into groups and made them to test the glass samples. All of them were taken from the same batch, and the instrument was the same. So there was no additional error that came because of these changes. So all of them were tested in the same place at the same on the same day, which is also something that matters, because glass is something that does get affected by moisture or humidity based on the type of glass. So all of them being the same, we want to look at what the distribution of the fracture strength is like. So what was the test like? It had a what is called as a 3-point bending or a flexure test, where the glass pane is kept between rollers, 3-point or 4-point bending, which means there are 2 rollers on top and 2 rollers at the bottom, and you apply a load from the top and it sort of bends. And so this region which sees tension will break first. But at which location does it break, here or here or here, will depend on the defect distribution of that particular sample. And usually, because glass does not show any ductility by which there is no ability for plastic deformation of glass, as you all would have seen, like, you drop it, you break it. So the load displacement curve and converted stress strain curve looks like this. It's linear elastic up to a certain point, and then it suddenly breaks at certain point. There is no plastic deformation strain. So the strains are very low. You can see this is just about 3%, but this is also not corrected for the cross-head displacement. So the total strain is low. This is flexure stress versus flexure strain. For our purpose, we will just call it as a stress strain graph. So from this, you calculate the failure stress. But 3 samples here are not good enough, because I'll show you the data that we got. This was data which Kevin has shared with me, and I should also acknowledge Kushal, who was probably the TA for that course. So the fracture strength is distributed across the sample numbers from something that goes as high as about 281 MPa to something that goes as low as 140 MPa. So there is a large scatter that way in the data, right? So there is this scatter, and if you try to plot it in terms of a histogram, you also see that it does not show a normal distribution. The data, you can see a normal distribution should have followed a bell curve, but you can see that when there's, so what is split here is it's about 15 MPa ranges of stress equally separated, and the number of samples which broke at the lowest stress, then at a higher stress and at higher stresses and so on. So you can see that it goes up, down and so on. And if you see the box and whisker plot also, you'll see the median is skewed. It's not the same as mean. And therefore, this tells us that this is not a normal distributed data. So what do you do with it? You can fit what is called as the cumulative distribution function, which you can again learn in the R part. This is a good example to therefore use. We will give you the data sheets, probably not today, maybe in the next batch, next week. So what you're plotting here is the cumulative probability distribution function. As a function, so on the x-axis is the fracture stress or the rupture stress, and what is plotted here on the y-axis is the probability of failure. That means if you take at 100 MPa, you could see from the data earlier that at 100 MPa there were no failures, right? So the probability of failure is 0. But at about 130 or 135 MPa, you should start seeing failure. So maybe only one sample failed at 135 MPa, so the probability of failure is close to 0. So its value is low. But as you increase the requirement of stress, then the probability of failure keeps on increasing, and the function is looks something like this. So what this tells you is that at about 280 MPa or so, the probability of all of them failing is maximum. So 1 minus that will give you the survival probability. Okay, so one can calculate what is called as the for the Weibull distribution. One can calculate the shape parameter, which is also called as the Weibull modulus, and the scale parameter, which is the sigma naught. I will show you the equation. So that is obtained at a survival probability of 37% or a failure probability of 63% or so. So it is slightly different from the mean for a Weibull distribution. The scale parameter happens to be at this value. So the probability distribution function will look like this. It is 1 minus p, where p is the probability of failure, is equal to exponential minus sigma by sigma naught to the power m, where sigma is the fracture stress that you are recording and sigma naught is the scale parameter that I was talking about, which is slightly different from the mean of the data usually. And so how do you plot this? How would you plot when you have the probability of failure, and let's say you already also calculated the sigma by sigma naught? How would you plot this curve now that given that we have looked at something like this yesterday? Let's say my intention is to get this slope of this whole curve. The slope is this exponent here, which is called as the Weibull modulus, also known as the shape parameter. Anyone can tell me how you would plot this?
No idea, madam.
I have already shown it here. So you cannot plot something directly in R when you have a complicated function, right? To get the value of m. So first you take logarithm on both sides, which is what we did in yesterday's lecture as well, right? So first logarithm will give you, natural log of 1 minus p is equal to minus sigma by sigma naught to the power m. So that will bring you to what stage we were yesterday, where we had some sort of a exponent in a power law. So you have to take the double logarithm now so that m becomes the slope of that curve. Okay, so if you take again the logarithm on both sides, then it will be double logarithm of 1 minus p is equal to this thing is already gone. It will become equal to minus m times logarithm of sigma by sigma naught. So that is what is plotted. So this data we have and this data we got from our measurements, and using that you get the basically this is the black data points are the ones which are the actual true data points, and you can fit it to get the slope, and this fit has to be a linear fit. You can calculate whether the residual of the fit is what kind of distribution it has and so on. We have not done that here. So you can check the quality of the fit also using R square if you like, but the m value comes out to be around 5 here. Now a value of less than 10 tells us that the variation in defect distribution in this material is high. Okay, so it's not a good quality glass to use in that sense. So you can do a quality control check by using these kinds of distribution measurements. It's also used to identify certain mechanisms, but for the purpose of what we did or what we showed, this is telling us that the variation is in defect distribution in the glass is high. So a lower value of Weibull modulus is not preferred. A higher value of Weibull modulus is preferred. For metals, it's actually high at greater than 100. So the reliability in data is obtained from metals is very high. Whereas for ceramics and glasses, you will have to do many more tests in order to be more sure of the value that you're getting. Yeah. The last part that I would like to talk about is how to do some non-linear fits as well. So I'll show a case study again from a sample which I'm trying to break. Okay, but in this case, this is a brittle polymer instead of glass. It is a transparent brittle polymer. These are used in mobile cases, in your dental applications. It's called polymethyl methacrylate. It's used in several even microelectronic devices. But it's a very useful sample for fracture tests as well, because it's transparent. You can see what is happening, where the crack is growing and so on. So this sample is now held fixed at the two ends in its leg. It's like a table sample. It has two-leg table. So it is held at the two legs and it is loaded from the top. So it's bending basically. It's not being pulled, but it is bending. And we have created a notch here. So it's already pre-cracked and we want to see the, in a way, we want to see if there is a pre-existing defect in the material, what load would it fail at? That is something that we want to see. And in order to normalize it, we use something called as the fracture energy, which is joule per meter square. That means energy per unit extension of crack area. Doesn't matter what it is. We are trying to find this particular value called fracture energy, G. Okay. And the generic formula which connects the fracture energy to the load displacement curve is given here, which is given by P square by 2B dC by dA. Now, P is the load that the material is seeing. So, for example, if you did this test, you would get a load displacement curve. Just take one of the samples here. Don't worry what the other samples are. Let's say you had an initial certain crack. So the sample would continue to take load up to a certain point, and then you see there is a deviation from linearity here. That's the point at which the crack actually started to grow. Okay, but although this sample is brittle, the loading condition is such that it will control the crack growth. So you can see, initially there is a crack growth, then it grows to a certain slightly higher, at a higher load, it grows longer. Further increasing the load, it will grow even more longer, and so on. So the curve initially is linear elastic because the material is just deforming. Once the crack starts to grow, it shows a deviation from linearity. Okay, so using again that slope fitting that we were talking about, you can get the load at which the crack started to grow. Now, if I unload the entire sample and reload it at for a specimen with the longer crack now, then it will load like this. That means the slope of this curve is going to be much lower than the slope of the original sample. The original sample had a shorter crack. So for the same displacement, it could take a higher load. But when you have a longer crack, the specimen cannot take the same load for that displacement. So it's going to be able to take a much lower load. So the slope is lower. So the slope of the load displacement curve is called as stiffness, and the inverse of that slope is called as the compliance. And the compliance is represented by capital C. So dC by dA refers to the change in compliance as a function of crack length. Now, if I tell you that the stiffness decreases, you see that this is at a smaller crack length, this is at a longer crack length, and this is at a further longer crack length. Stiffness S1, S2, S3. Which one has a higher stiffness? Which one has a lower stiffness? Can you tell me that from the curve? This is just reading from the curve. I'm asking which one has a higher slope and which one has a lower slope. A higher slope is equal to higher stiffness, and a lower slope is equal to lower stiffness.
Black line, higher slope, blue line, lower slope.
Yes. So that's very clear, right? So the black line has a higher stiffness. So in terms of compliance, which is the inverse of stiffness, this is having a lower compliance. This is having a higher compliance. Okay, because it's the inverse. So the compliance increases with increasing crack length. So this is increasing crack length. The stiffness is decreasing. Therefore, compliance is increasing. So dC by dA increases as a function of crack length. But we don't know how it is increasing. What is the function dependence on crack length? So we want to find out that first. So in order to do that, we can, do the experiment, of course, but it is far easier to do a simulation, which is done through a finite element code. Now, finite element code or simulation comes with its own errors. We will talk about it in a while. But you can have the same beam modeled in the computer, and you can, load versus the displacement plots can be extracted for different crack lengths. So I'll initially start with some crack length A. I will increase the crack length to A1. I'll start with A1 and I'll increase it to A2, A3, A4. And for each of those, I will get the load versus displacement response for such a load for each of these specimens. Then I will get, for those load displacement response, I'll get the corresponding slopes, and the inverse of the slope will give me compliance, just like we talked about. Now I want to fit the compliance as a function of A. So let's see whether that fit is going to be a linear fit or not in the first place. Whether the compliance increases linearly as a function of A, or does it fit something else. Once you do that functional fit, once you check that the fit is good, then you can differentiate it. Yeah, then you can differentiate it and get dC by dA. And using the form of the equation given here, everything now is available. You can calculate what is called as G. There is another way to directly calculate G from the finite element simulation, which I will, not get into the details of how, but I will still tell you that there is a way of verifying. See, you will get something from your simulation, but how do you know for sure that that is the actual value of G you should get? So since the finite element simulation can independently give you G and also give you the load displacement response, so both can be calculated and the verification can be done. So that is what the exercise we are going to show you. So how to calculate the G directly? The finite element is composed of meshes, and the solutions are numerically calculated. So numerical solutions are always approximate solutions. They are never exact solutions. It will never come exactly equal to the analytical solution, but it will come close to it. You should try for it to come close to it. Otherwise, you are wrong in certain ways. So this is the mesh in front of the crack tip. If you see a blow up of the mesh in front of the crack tip, you will see very fine meshes, so that I will get the stress distribution around these regions captured very well. If you looked at the graphs here, these again are contour maps, which shows the stresses in the region very close to the crack tip, the stresses are very high and the gradients in stress are high. Whereas far away from it, the stress is low and the gradient is nearly zero. So we want to, look at the several contours around this crack tip, where we are going to calculate what is called as G, the value on the left hand side. So when you have to calculate this value of G, I'm going to obtain the value of G from one contour, which is close to the crack, second contour, again, the next contour, the third contour, the fourth contour, and so on, till as many contours as, we can possibly get, until we get what is called as convergence. So what happens when you get the values from very close to the contour, the stress gradients being very high, there is an error associated with what we get in terms of G. Whereas you go to a certain optimum distance, then you will start getting stable values of G. So we'll see that. So if you look at different contours, starting from the first contour very close to the crack tip to the faraway contour, then these are the blue dots are the actual data points. You see that the initial value of G that we get is high, and it sort of doesn't seem to match with the rest of the data, which is hovering around, let's say about 70. The value, don't worry, this is joule per meter square, it's around 70 here. But here it's sort of high. So I told you that we already know that we should avoid very close to the contours, very close to the crack tip. So let's say first avoid the first 4 contours and see how good the fit is. What should happen is that theoretically it is known that G should not be dependent on the path that we have taken. The path is the contour path. So it should not depend, but let's see whether there is a dependence or not. So in this case, if you try to fit the data, this is actually from contour 5 to contour 15, okay? So you see that there is some correlation. It's not a horizontal curve which shows zero correlation. There is still some correlation. And if you plot the residuals, well, it goes up and down from plus minus. But more or less, this can be attributed as a random distribution. I think Professor Guru Rajan should take a look at this data and be able to comment more. But let's say I had a problem even in the up to the 7th contour or so, I still have some other reasons to avoid the data. So I will remove that data as well. I'll not get in the details, but I will take only the last 8 contours and then average. Then the dependence on the contours has reduced further, and I get some mean and standard deviation. So this is how I calculate my left-hand side of the equation. The right-hand side, I said there are again errors which typically result because of the discretization. So the entire continuum solid body is discretized into small elements. So the solution is approximate, and the finer you make the element, the more closer you are to the actual solution. Well, that's not entirely correct, but we'll go in that direction. So if you go on decreasing the element size, or what here is called as the mesh size, if you go on decreasing it, then you see that what you have measured something from that, the measured data, which is the displacement, is changing first. So there is no convergence achieved at the larger domain sizes, larger mesh sizes. But when you go to smaller mesh sizes, you see that this measured value stabilizes. You should not go further finer than this, because you can see that the CPU time, that is the time that the processor uses to compute these solutions, is exponentially sort of increasing. So you should not be aiming for the finest possible. You should always be looking for convergence at the optimum mesh size. And that was what was done. Once that is done, you can get the load displacement response, like I said, for different crack lengths. So for smaller crack length, you'll see higher slope. For longer and longer crack lengths, you will see the slope which is decreasing, therefore compliance which is increasing. Ignore the red and green curves. If you just look at the black curve here, compliance is plotted as a function of crack length. And you can see the data points and also the fitted curve. But if you look at just the data points, what do you see? I mean, you could have fitted into a linear or a straight line, but then the DC by dA would not have any value at all, right? So because this would, if it fitted into a straight line, then the dc by da would be just a constant value. Well, you could try it. There's no harm in it, but it just shows that the dc by da itself is not a function of crack length. Usually, if you try to identify the trends, you could go with determining the coefficient of determination, that is the R square for the fit for different polynomials of different orders. Let's say I'll next try the quadratic fit, the second order fit. So in the second order polynomial, it may fit slightly better. I got a slightly higher R square value. But is that the only way? I mean, do I have to just go on till you have more and more R square? Well, I can also fit it. Let's say how many data points do I have? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. So I can go to a 10th order polynomial and it will fit exactly well. But that's not the way to do it, right? Because then I cannot capture any deviations in the data, and there are actually errors hidden in this data. So we should go for the lowest order polynomial, which makes physical sense as well. So the rule of thumb would be that I can see that there is a change of slope that may have, that is beginning to happen here. And there is a change of slope that has sort of happened here. So there are two change of slopes. So my polynomial order would be about 3 in this case. So I use this n+1 sort of a rule to fit. So that is what the student has done, Tejas has done. So he has fit a cubic polynomial to this curve, and he has got the coefficients. For some reason, I couldn't get the data on the errors in the fits. So I would again leave that exercise to you if you are able to do it. Then it would be good to see how good this data is. And the other thing is reporting the accuracy. You should not be reporting beyond the accuracy of your measurements itself. So the coefficients cannot, have an accuracy which is better than the data that is being measured. So make sure you all, also there are units for each of these coefficients, but the coefficient for, so the compliance has B0, B1, B2 and B3, which is obtained by a cubic fit. And then you can do a DC by DA directly at different crack lengths, which is what is plotted here. And then you get what is called as the G. So the right hand side G and the left hand side G are plotted. And if you look at just this black curve again, the right hand side of the equation will give you only one single data point for each crack length, because we have just done one simulation per condition. But the left hand side, we got the G values from the average and the standard error associated with the different contours. So that's why there is a standard deviation, standard error, I think, plotted here. But you see that for most of the data points, there is a very close fit between the measured and the left hand side measure and the right hand side measure, which tells us that this particular simulation is doing okay in terms, and we have of course verified it through other things. The calibration problems will be shown more in detail in the next few lectures by Professor Pitapan. So this is what tells us, and you can again check whether how well these are fitting close to each other. So again, you can do a analysis of how good the match is between the two. So that is also something that we can provide you the data for. I think the TAs will be able to explain, because they are the ones who have created the data file and have shared with me. And I would like to summarize that we looked at contour maps and extracting histograms and some other information from them. Handling some log normal or Weibull distributions and cumulative probability distribution functions. And we also looked at how one can fit nonlinear and polynomial functions and verify whether those fits are fine. So in this case, in R, I think, again, Professor Gururajan can comment, I think you'll have to linearize it and then fit it into a linear model. Is that what it is? I don't know if it's here.
For what?
So let's say I have this sort of function that I need to fit is a polynomial of third degree.
No, you don't have to. So what we do is that we take A
and we make a squared as another variable y.
Another, yeah, right.
A cube
A
as the
cube is
third
also,
variable
right.
z. So
Yeah.
then it becomes a linear model,
That's
but
good.
multilinear. It is b0,
Yeah.
b1, x, b2, y,
Right.
b3, z. Yeah.
Right. So
Then
you
we
have to
will
transform it like that, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's it.
Okay. I am done, and thank you very much again. And please let us know if you have questions. I know it's probably quite technical, this set of data, but the fitting and the way the data is we looked at, that is general. You have any data, you'll have to look at it in the same way, and you're practicing plotting of various kinds of data already. So we will slowly get there.